Hi, everyone. I spoke with everyone earlier in the plenary. My name is Justin Rosen-Smolin. I'm Vice President for Thriving Communities and Partnerships here at Reconstructing Judaism. And welcome to Thriving Communities, Complicated Times, leading through highs, lows, and everything in between. And I am so grateful to be joined today by dear colleagues, Rabbi Ruhi Sophie Motzkin Rubenstein of TBI in Eugene, and Rabbi Rachel Weiss of JRC in Evanston, Illinois. It's so good to have you both here, and also grateful to my dear colleague, Rabbi Micah Gerwin-Weiss, for joining us here, also representing the Thriving Communities team at Reconstructing Judaism and keeping us on track for the next 45 minutes or so together. We are so thrilled that each of you has decided to spend a busy December afternoon with us on a weekend, and delighted that you chose to come and learn from Ruhi and Rachel about what their leadership has been like and what their communities have been like, how they have stayed true to values, how they have stumbled and also grown, and how they have transformed since October 7th, 2023, and hopefully begin to think about and digest some lessons for each of us, no matter where we sit culturally, geographically, generationally, politically. What are some things each of us can take away in our membership in Jewish life and in our leadership in Jewish life from the lessons that Ruhi and Rachel, and of course, their communities have learned over the past year. So I'm going to offer just a few logistical notes, and then we'll dive right in. First, we are pleased to make this chat public. We know that we were just 90 minutes together in a plenary where that wasn't available, and there are folks who may want to say hi to friends across the country they haven't seen in a while. And certainly we know that there will be questions for both Ruhi and Rachel. I just want to offer for everyone that, number one, a friendly reminder, everyone to join our program today agreed to norms for how we want to show up together in community and what respectful dialogue and questioning can look like. So please reference them as you think about how you're going to share publicly in this space. And two, we just want you to know that what you share will be public with everyone. So we're all on the same page. And without further ado, we'll get started. So let's start with getting to know you and your community. Introduce yourselves, tell us what you love about where you live and serve, what makes it a special place, and tell us how your community connected with and navigated Israel-Palestine in a pre-October 7th world. And Rabbi Rachel Weiss, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Rabbi Rachel Weiss. It's nice to see so many familiar faces from across our movement, from congregants to people who live in Chicago, to colleagues, to Camp Havaya parents and alumni and all the folks. It's great to see you all. So I'm Rabbi Rachel Weiss. I am the rabbi at the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation in Evanston, Illinois, and most people know us as JRC. We are a 425 household-ish congregation, although we've actually grown by 40 households since July, which is a very exciting moment for us. But we're in Evanston, which is the first suburb north of Chicago. And I have been part of JRC actually since 1984. I grew up in this congregation. My family joined when I was a rising fourth grader that asked to go to Hebrew school. And I took a 13-year hiatus to go and go to RRC and then serve Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in Manhattan, and then came back here as lead rabbi in 2016. I love JRC in that we are a community that really is a community, that we take that belonging as a very, very dear part of who we are. There's a lot of synagogues in the Chicagoland area. There are not a lot that are like JRC. We have 2 Reconstructionist affiliates here. And, part of what we see with one another is that we actually are a community that really does show up for one another and engaged in things that are hard. We're very diverse in our membership, whether it is folks who live in Chicago, folks who live in the suburbs, folks who are families with children, people who never had children and are here seeking adult community, empty nesters, people who are aging, all different ways that people show up together. About half of our households identify as households that are interfaith, where one parent or one adult in the household is not Jewish. We have a growing Jews of color population here in the synagogue. And we are a very, very broad tent around Israel-Palestine. That is to say, we have people in the community who will very actively and openly talk about the fact that they are Zionists, they are anti-Zionists, they are non-Zionists, and then a very large swath of the congregation that says that's not actually a core part of how I identify myself Jewishly, and I'm not sure where I'd put myself in that spectrum. So a couple of notes about, JRC is my home community, so I get to, be the rabbi to people who I've known since I was a child, but is also a community that has grown and changed in the world. And so I think, we are a different community than we were in the 80s, and a community that really puts that Reconstructionist philosophy of lay leaders are the heart of our congregation. There's a piece in that purple book that Rabbi Richard Hirsch wrote that anyone who's talking about leadership in their congregations might be familiar with, that says that the rabbi is an authority, but not the authority. And that we live that here at JRC, where my voice is one of many, which I really appreciate because there's so much wisdom in our members who have what to say and what to do. And we really lean into that and rely on our memberships to partner with one another and with me to make sure that we're speaking a complex, nuanced voice of who we actually are. So prior to October 7th, what was our congregational relationship to Israel-Palestine is not an easy question to answer. Many people might know that prior to my arrival at JRC, our previous rabbi went through a long period of discernment before becoming an anti-Zionist and ultimately was not able to have the political voice that he wanted to have in that moment and be the lead rabbi of our congregation. And so he left the congregation quite publicly in a way that fractured the congregation in a fairly traumatic way in 2014. And we as a community, for the year before I got here, the congregants, the cantor, and an interim rabbi spent a year and a half really doing very intentional trauma work to say to the community, how do we show up as a community together when we're so fractured? Some people very much supported that rabbi. Some people were very much against that rabbi. A lot of people said, what's happening to my synagogue? I had no idea this was even here. And it really took us into a place of we can't talk about this at all. And for the first few years from when I came in 2016 through, really last year, we had tried and failed to create an Israel-Palestine programming group, to teach, to experiment with different ways that we taught in our religious school, different kinds of programs. And many people basically said, this is too hot and this is too painful. I don't want to talk about this. And so on October 7th, the president and I looked at each other that Shabbat morning and said, okay, well, it's now. And we put together what I'll talk about a little bit later, was a very intentional group called our Israel-Palestine Working Group, which were essentially 10 hand-selected people in addition to the two of us who represent a broad swath of the congregation, and said, the time is now to engage. We need you. If you don't want the voice of the congregation on Israel-Palestine to be one rabbi's voice, then we need to create a mechanism where the whole community has a voice and input and can talk together. And that's what we did. So that's a little bit about who we are and where we are and how we got here.
Thank you so much for that opening, and look forward to learning more shortly. Rabbi Ruby, can you tell us a bit about Eugene, the TBI?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be with old friends and beloved colleagues here today. So since the summer of 2015, I have been the lead rabbi and mostly solo rabbi at Temple Beth Israel in Eugene, Oregon, which is a beautiful place with a great bike culture, wonderful local food. If any of you are ever coming through town, please let me know. We'd love to put you up for a Shabbat meal. It's also got, to be honest, a pretty, I hope it's not offensive to say, but a Goyish Pacific Northwest culture, which is to say, anyone who's from New York seems sort of stereotypically Jewish here, whether they're Jewish or not. I often wind up feeling like I'm a little too loud, a little too much in Eugene, and also getting a lot of appreciation from other Jews and from other East Coasters for being that here. But I love this place, and the synagogue that I serve is is not only the regional synagogue, but also functions as a Jewish cultural center. Temple Beth Israel is over 90 years old, was founded as a conservative synagogue, and in the mid-90s shifted affiliation in order to be more embracing of intermarried families, children of intermarriage, and LGBTQ families, but is still sort of in many ways the same, like aesthetically conservative-ish big tent regional synagogue that it had been. There's a small Jewish federation here, but like our closest JCC is in Portland, a 2-hour drive away. There's a small Orthodox shul that actually was founded as a breakaway from this synagogue, also in the 1990s, all actually in part out of anger at the then rabbi, my predecessor, who insisted on just talking about the Palestinian plight sometimes. And there were some people so angry at that for that, among other reasons, they started a breakaway shul. But functionally, this is the only synagogue in town if you want Jewish cultural programming or to have your children have B'nai Mitzvah. People are going to come to our synagogue, and if any Israel programming is going to happen in this town from a Jewish perspective, it is likely going to be organized out of this synagogue. So I name that just to say, because other ways demographically, it's actually quite similar to JRC. It's about 425 families. It leans politically progressive. There is no Israel consensus. I would say the largest Israel consensus is the ambivalent middle that would prefer not to think about Israel at all, would prefer to think of Israel as really far away, except for when something happens that puts Israel in the news and then people feel really put on the spot to have an opinion. But, we have like maybe a minion of people who are AIPAC members, and probably slightly larger than a minion of people who are J Street members, and maybe a minion of people who, if pressed, would identify as anti-Zionist. So when I arrived here, one of the first initiatives I took as a new rabbi about 9 years ago was to start an Israel program task force. And I particularly sought to recruit people from across the spectrum of orientations towards Israel and Zionism. And I had a group of about 5, sometimes 6 people, chaired by someone who was not me, thank goodness, who would get together. I mean, our first 6 months was just establishing norms of how the people in the group were going to treat each other and how we were going to share honestly about our feelings and what parameters we were going to set. One parameter that we came up with is that we only wanted to feature speakers who were Jewish or who were Palestinian. We weren't interested in pundits who were neither of those. And another parameter we said is that we only wanted to, that we would have lines around the discourse, that we really only wanted to promote and give platforms to people who acknowledged and supported, at least in theory, the legitimate claim of Jews to the land of Israel and the legitimate claim of Palestinians to a national homeland in the same place, with a lot of permission for arguing about the logistics of how that could be and why it isn't already. Now, unfortunately, and we did 5 years of really great programming and resource sharing with our community. Around the beginning of COVID, that group started to decay. Our chair moved away, and a lot of, and COVID happened. So we were actually not super well set up to have a robust and diverse group of people ready to make thoughtful Israel programming happen when October 7th hit. And I think this is where I turn the conversation back to Justin to ask us the next question.
Thank you, Rabbi Ruby, and thank you, Rabbi Rachel, for those really great openings and windows into your communities. So let's begin to explore the world in your communities since October 7th. Can each of you share, no doubt you have many, and I've had the opportunity to visit both of you and hear just some of them and been so uplifted. But can you offer us some anecdotes or vignettes that capture how you've led your community through this time? And let's begin with one each, and then we'll see where we end up. And we're starting here specifically. Let me just fine tune that a bit. We'll begin with an example where you were able to help your community learn and grow over the past year, something that makes you proud. We'll have the opportunity for the constructive pieces in just a moment, but let's start on this note.
So, so one of the things that I am incredibly proud of is our Israel-Palestine Working Group, which is a group, as I mentioned before, that was handpicked by invitation of members of JRC who were not all the same. So our then president, Emily Harris, and I were sitting together actually at a family service the morning of October 7th, and we kept, in these moments, these sort of fleeting moments of those, everybody knows those looks you give your president across the room where it says, like, here we go. And then many, many conversations, and Nancy's our president-elect. So many of those are coming your way in great ways. And spent a lot of time deeply talking to say, what do we do? We have to put this together. And so our Israel-Palestine Working Group, and like many folks, it was, does this have a hyphen? Does this have a slash? What's the punctuation? How does that communicate? Was made of 10 members of JRC who all identified differently. We had people who identified as Zionists, and we are, when most of the people who use the term Zionist at JRC to describe themselves, I would say are progressive Zionists. If they had to align with a national political movement, it would probably be J Street. We don't have folks who are much more further right than that. So very center to very left Zionists, folks who identified as non-Zionists, and folks who identified as anti-Zionist. We had someone who was Israeli in the group. We had people in their 20s and people in their 60s and 70s. We had people who were not Jewish in that group, but longtime members of the synagogue. We had people who were therapists, people who were teachers, and again, many people. There's only 10, so they hit more than one box there. We had people who were straight and people who were queer. It was a way to say, how do we get lots of different voices in this moment? And what we agreed upon in our first meeting was, this is not about statements. This is not about, putting together, what does JRC think? This is about, how do we hold our community to make sure we don't fall apart? Because the very real risk that people had lived through was, we fell apart. And so the first impetus was to say, how do we actually stay together? I have been saying for over a year, I've been saying long ago when we were doing traumatic conversations about Israel and looking at what had happened in JRC's past as trauma, that we have to figure out a way that no matter what is happening in the world or between each other, if somebody dies in the congregation and we need a minyan, you're going to be okay showing up for Shiva. That human connection of caring about one another was paramount. But this committee that met sort of every night for the first couple of nights as information was unfolding, pretty quickly went from, how do we help people learn? How do we help people engage? What do we say? For me, it was, I need a sounding board. This is what I think I'm going to write to the congregation, but what am I missing here? Where are my blind spots? Where are my folks going to help hold this? And very quickly, two things emerged. The first was, we needed a vigil to acknowledge grief and pain, and we managed to have a vigil that acknowledged grief and pain, recognizing that it was not all coming from the same place or directed in the same direction, but that the universal experience of grief was heavy and real. The second piece, after 3 or 4 days of people saying, we don't need to say something, somebody in the group said, I think we need to say something. Because it was clear that the other congregations around us were all either changing their profile pictures to blue and white or red, green, and black, or we're saying, if you don't agree with us 100%, that's fine, but don't be here. We had a different message, which was, how can we be nuanced? How can we use the language of non-binary gender and spectrum to talk about the fact that this is not a binary issue and complex? And so we had someone who identified as a Zionist in his 60s and a non-Zionist in their 30s and an anti-Zionist in his 40s who gathered together and said, I think we need to say something. And what unfolded was an incredibly deep and rich and painful conversation about what a statement of ethics and morals and Jewish teachings, but also that said who we were, could unfold. And I'll put that statement later. I don't want folks to get distracted from the conversation by reading it, but it's on the JRC website. And within a month, we had passed it through the congregation with many, over 200 people weighing in on it. We had an Israeli member of our congregation who attended her very first board meeting ever to have this conversation and said she actually walked away from that board meeting feeling better at the end of the meeting than she had going in, which any of us who've ever been in board meetings know that's a huge win. But the idea of being able to talk and listen to each other and to have a group, for me, it was, I'm not doing this by myself, which was terrifying for me to begin with, just in the complexity and the trauma and the grief and the scale, but to say we are modeling the belonging of different voices together. And the second piece is that our people that sort of grew out of that is that our committee said, you, Rabbi, cannot be the only person who's holding all of us. You will, in a very Yitro Moses way, say you will wear yourself out. And so every Friday night for 6 months, following October 7th, we had a session called Connecting in Community and Conversation, in which 2 members of the synagogue facilitated a conversation and grief discussion together, in which they talked about, they invited anyone just to show up and talk about how they were feeling from all different ways. Those people facilitating were trained together by some members of our committee, but they were therapists, social workers, teachers, facilitators. And their number one thing they said to me is, Rabbi, we love you, but you can't be here. You can't go to this because you're carrying too much and this is going to wear you down. We need a way where we can help do some of this work too. And that continued for about 6 months and was really transformative for many people.
Rabbi Rachel, thank you so much. Rabbi Ruhi.
Thank you. And as often is the case, I am in awe of my teacher, Rabbi Rachel Weiss.
Ruchi and I used to work together, which is such a treat to be able to, we work together in a lot of contexts, but it's such a treat to be able to be here together as colleagues. It's so great.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's quite enough dynamic tension to make this panel as interesting as it could otherwise be, but it's a pleasure. So quantifying success is really hard. And there are many, especially if the question is framed in terms of learning or pushing people. I don't think I have tried very much to push people to grow in their information. I have sent people the directions that they could go to if they need more information. But the American Jewish response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, does not suffer from a dearth of information, but from a dearth of empathy. Mm-hmm. And so my moments that I have felt best about as a facilitator and holder of space have been the moments where I have pushed people towards greater empathy, whether towards each other or towards Palestinians or towards Israelis, depending on where their political orientations are. I think, generally as rabbi, I take the stance of I'm pushing you towards empathy with whoever you're having trouble feeling empathy for right now. But if we want to think in terms of a program where I really know I did well and not harm, one of our teens reached out to me and said, it's really hard to be in high school right now. It's so confusing because we're being put on the spot. I'm being accused of genocide because I'm Jewish. I don't like what Israel's doing, but I also think I shouldn't be accused of genocide because I'm Jewish. And so I just had like a tea date with as many of the teens in my community as wanted to come over to my home on a Sunday evening and facilitated them talking through how this moment was confusing for them. And I shared resources with them. I pointed them to Standing Together and A Land for All and Trua. But I also gave them permission to refuse to be geopolitical experts, to say to tell their peers, I don't get all of this, but I know that Israelis are people and I know that Palestinians are people, and I refuse to be put into the position of defending one at the expense of the other, or of denying my Jewishness as a prerequisite for standing with Palestinians. And I think just, I saw, I'm not following the chat, but I saw a flash of a question that just came in about non-binary language. And I know that's in response to what Rabbi Weiss said, but I think the language about this conflict tends to be so binary. You're pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestinian. You believe that what's happening is genocide, or you believe that Palestinians are terrorists. And I think every time I have been able to crack a space for people to live between those poles and say, like, yeah, what the IDF is doing is terrible. Yes, Hamas is terrible. Like, one side doesn't need to be good for the other side to be bad, but also conversely, civilians don't deserve to be killed, even if they are in a place or supporting leaders who are doing terrible things. So the more I can just crack that space beyond the binary, between the binary, that those moments are the moments that feel like success to me.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ruhi. And just listening to you both in conversation, you're reminding me, of course, that we need not live in binaries, even as the world tries to compress us into them. And the way you've led in this past year has been to give people space to ask questions and also grieve and figure out how to stay in dialogue and community with one another. And any one of us here, whether we are the rabbi of a community or not, by virtue of participating in Reconstructionist Jewish life, we know how hard and messy that is. And you've each confided in me with admirable humility of moments where your community did not hit the mark, or an approach you tried did not land as you had hoped. And so I'm wondering if, conversely to what you shared just now, can each of you share something that did not work out so well over this past year and help us take away some lessons from it? And we'll begin with you this time, Rabbi Ruhi.
Okay. Going back to what counts as success is really subjective, because the cases that I'm about to share are both cases where people were really appreciative that these programs happened, and I still felt pretty crappy. I named earlier that my lines are that if I'm gonna platform you, I want you to acknowledge the legitimate Jewish claim to a homeland in Israel and the legitimate Palestinian claim to a homeland there, by whatever name, I'm comfortable saying Palestine. And there were two cases where, in the interests of pluralism and in the interests of serving the needs of quite distraught members, I did give platforms to members who did not hold to those boundaries. To be fair, one in each direction. And it was pretty publicly clear that they did not hold to those boundaries, and people expressed feeling really grateful for hearing those perspectives or validated by those perspectives. And yet I feel that I missed the mark, because I know what feels like an ethical boundary to me. And in this moment that feels important. And I wish I would have found some other way to meet those congregants' needs. And interestingly, both of those congregants, to the far right of my boundary, such as it is, and to the far left of my boundary, despite my having platformed them, have since left the community. So that also feels like there's a failure in there somewhere, somebody's failure. I'm not going to say it's entirely mine, but certainly it's partially mine.
So something that I've been saying for the last year and a half is that the most ubiquitous word in all of Torah is "and." That if you look at an open Torah scroll, just about, not all of them, but almost every single column of Torah starts with a vav, which makes this a continuous story. And that and I have been saying that since the beginning. It was Parshat Breshit last year when October 7th, just after October 7th happened, that first Shabbat. And that was the drash that I gave, was that and everything this and this and this. And so I thought in, everything we did last year took on a new lens of, well, how are we going to possibly celebrate this? How can we do this? How will this, everything felt like we were starting anew. And we were approaching the holidays of Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron. And I said, well, why don't we put a program together on a Friday night Shabbat that is closest to it and call it a Shabbat of grief and hope, commemorating Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, and Nakba. And I used those three phrases together and said anyone who has any reading, piece of music, poem, something that expresses what you need to hear on this day in this setting, you send it to me. As long as you're willing to read it yourself out of your mouth and yourself from the Bima is welcome and open to you. And it really didn't work. I thought it would be beautiful and complex and I was going to hold it all, and it really didn't work. First of all, there were lots of people who initially saw either the word Yom HaAtzmaut or the word Nakba and said, how dare you? How could you do this in this way? One inherently can't coexist in this. And I was really trying to name the complexity of the fact that for one group of the world, this meant independence and the establishment of home. And at the same time, the same action signified catastrophe, which is what Nakba means, in exile for another group of people. And how could we possibly mark that together? There were not a small number of people that assumed I was lumping Yom HaShoah in there too, and talked about it from that place, who didn't even read what we said, but saw all of the Yoms and thought, oh, and Yom HaShoah too, how dare you invoke the Holocaust in this moment and make that equation, which said much more about where people were holding and what they were feeling. What didn't work out about it is that not so many people came because I think people were really nervous about it. And I think some people felt like we just need a place to say the state of Israel was established historically out of these places, and we need a moment to feel good about that. And not everything also has to hold this. There were some people that said that was an act of precursor to genocide. How could you do that together? We ended up with a lot of mostly kind of watered down Yehuda Amichai poetry in that service, not surprisingly. Lovely poems, but it didn't do what we thought we would do. And afterwards, we all sat with that and go, well, it didn't go so well. How do we do that differently? It informed how we did our October 7th commemoration. It really tested us to say, is this a moment where and can exist? Or what does our community need to do and hear and focus on? It doesn't have to be everything all at once. Sometimes we can privilege one experience over the other. It caused us to look at what do Jews need in particular rather than just everyone, because as a synagogue, we're also privileging Jewish experience. And what do Jews need that might be particular than the rest of the community? And of course, what some Jews need is not the same thing as what other Jews need, and sometimes those things are in conflict. So it was not successful. It was a great idea, but we kept trying. And I think the idea of all of this was to not get bogged down in, well, we failed that, so I guess this isn't working, but to keep trying.
Thank you both for your candor in this question in particular, and also for reminding us that for whatever stumbling we might do as community members, participants, leaders in whatever way in communal life, that God willing, and may we trust in this, that what we've created together isn't so brittle that it falls apart when something isn't elegant or something doesn't go the way we had hoped. So I'm going to take facilitator's privilege, and we've also fleshed out a few other questions. We won't get to all of them. But now I get the chance to ask you at least one more. Let's go meta for a moment. What do you think has made this moment so hard in Jewish communal life? And within the realm of our influence as community leaders and members, across geographic or political differences, what could we do to make it more manageable? So like some reflective and some more practical. Like why is this so hard? And it feels so enormous sometimes. Like what can any of us possibly do?
So the thing that makes my head feel like it's exploding all the time is that all the reactive things that people are saying about this, and especially within the Jewish community, are true. It's true that global anti-Semitism is on the rise. It's true that anti-Semitism on the left is a problem. It's true that anti-Semitism on the right is a problem. It's true. Oh, sorry, my light goes off every half hour. It's true that Israel is committing war crimes. It's true that people who are oppressed are gonna express their outrage in increasingly desperate ways. And it's true that Israeli civilians shouldn't have to live in constant terror. So it's not, I think we are so trained to want to find the truth and reject the lies, to want to identify the good guys and condemn the bad guys. And this situation is so hard because it's all true. And so I wind up as rabbi often being in conversations where I'm having to, as I said earlier, kind of push people to see the truth that they don't want to see, which doesn't mean the thing that they do want to see is a lie. It just means it's not a complete truth. So I just keep trying to model nuance. You ask what we can do. I refuse to be pushed into an incomplete truth in reaction to other people's incomplete truths. And I call in my allies, I call in my non-Jewish colleagues and say, like, yeah, you can criticize Israel. In 2018, Rabbi Jill Jacobs wrote for the Washington Post a great article on how to criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. It's still pretty relevant. You can criticize Israel, do it without being anti-Semitic, do it mindfully. And, you know, similarly, saying to my more right-wing members, you can defend Israel, do it without denying Palestinian humanity or the legitimacy of Palestinian grievance. And I keep trying to model that. My own commitment is that I never speak about Israeli Jewish pain without also just naming the existence of Palestinians. So, for example, at services, every service we've done in the past year or so, we recite Achenu, the prayer for our siblings, our fellow Jews in captivity. And we say Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael, the traditional liturgy, our siblings, all Israelites, all Jews. And we add the phrase Achenu Kol Yoshvei Tevel, our siblings, all human beings. And when I introduce it, I always say, you know, especially for our fellow Jews still captive in Gaza, and for the many Palestinians equally captive, equally stuck in this situation.
I think one of the things that has made this year so hard is a profound sense of loneliness. I think that we are not just, as the Surgeon General talks about, in the post-pandemic loneliness, but for Jews who have often felt like we have community with other Jews or community with our, particularly in Reconstructionist communities, with our progressive allies on the left. For many of us, for rabbis who often feel like, oh, we have all our people, this has felt like an incredibly isolating, lonely place to be. My high holiday sermon for Rosh Hashanah this year, which is also on that JRC website, says the hardest question to answer this year has been, how are you? Because of the many layers of things that go through our minds to even think about answering that question. And I think the hardest thing has been that we imagine, it feels like the mental calculations we have to go through before we even engage is, will we be together in this way? Will this show up? How will this look? And the result is we say, well, maybe I just won't say anything. And we have made our circles smaller and smaller and smaller. And the feeling of isolation is terrible, which is, of course, exactly how authoritarianism wants it to be across the world. But the idea of what can we do? I spent in that high holiday sermon, I talk about this past year with my interfaith colleagues. The Evanston Interfaith Clergy and Leaders is a very strong group and has shown up together in every moment of crisis, except for this one. And when almost a week had gone by and I had not heard from them, I sent the strongest message of tochacha that I've ever written in an email to a large group of people and said, friends, where are you? And it was very clear that they didn't know what they needed to do or what they could do or what was happening for me and my other rabbinic colleague in town. And so once we broke the idea of we have got to talk to each other and listen to each other and see the humanity in each other and actually start actively cultivating relationships that are painful, and we can get through these pieces, it was really important, and it's exhausting. So I think that is a part of what helped in this. What were some of the strategies that showed up in combating the loneliness. Our interfaith group now, stronger than ever, did a public apology this year for their behavior over the last year, but also talked about how do we facilitated huge community-wide programs for education and then modeled how we talk to each other across difference. I think I'm seeing these questions in the chat about people who have very strong opinions. We all have very strong opinions, even if our opinion is, I don't know enough to have an opinion, so I'm just not going to say anything. That's an opinion. And I think creating spaces where other members we can use the Reconstructionist rubric of belonging. The heart of Judaism is the Jewish people. We have to be able to talk to each other. And I think we have to have other members that can call each other in and say, I know you have a lot to say, but so do I. And actually use ways to help people reflect on how they're doing and to sit and have those one-on-ones, right? The whole point of a chavruta relationship, of a one-on-one partnership, is not rooted in, can I argue strongly enough to change the other person's mind? It's, can I sit and study and dive in and, yes, argue about what's happening, but can I allow myself to be vulnerable enough to be changed myself? And I think that is a profound flip of how we think about what it means to push for who's right and to actually be in those communities of empathy that Rabbi Ruchi is talking about, but also these ways that we can say, lots of people need places to say, I don't know, I have to explore, I'm not sure, and to really, I think, lean into the relationship building, both in your congregations, but also with other people who may on the surface be looking like, oh, we are committed to these values in our church, and where would Jesus stand in the rubble in Gaza? To get to a place where the pastor turns around as he did to me and say, but how could I miss it? Jesus is sitting with you too, because you're broken. And to have that from those places where we risk out of our little bubbles and zones to sit with each other is profound. It takes a lot of time, but it is all about the belonging and the covenantal community that we're talking about here today.
Thank you, Rabbi Rachel, and thank you, Rabbi Ruchi. And we just have a few moments left, and I just want to share with everyone that I love how in the last 8 or so minutes, there have just been such rich comments and honest questions and perspectives that you're sharing. Not surprised, and I wish we had 90 minutes at least together, because I know that we could dive into them and maybe we could be creative with how we would do that. I want to just be very clear that Rabbi Mike and I are taking note of these questions. I've actually been copying them into a running document for myself, and they will inform forthcoming resources and opportunities from Reconstructing Judaism, and also specifically from the Thriving Communities team, as we think about and plan how we can better support you and fellow community members and leaders in having these really challenging conversations. They are being received with such open hearts and ears and minds, and we can't wait to turn them back over to you in usable format. 3 minutes left. And so the question I want to leave each of you on, and give you each a moment just to reflect back to us, is you've just been in dialogue with each other for about 40 minutes, and I know that you'll continue. What's one question that you have for your friend and colleague, your chavruta, that you want to make sure that we all hear? We're not going to answer that question, but what's one question you're leaving with for the other? Rabbi Rachel, why don't you start?
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. I think I want to acknowledge also that the two of us are sitting here in places geographically in the country that are really different than 60% of Reconstructionist congregations, which are on the East Coast and within spitting distance of many other folks. And I see other of our colleagues who are and our members who are located in some different kinds of places. Hello, Duluth, Minnesota. Hi, David. But I think the idea of how might you use to your advantage the big tent of we are only one place in town, and the notion for folks who say, I just can't be in this one place, but then I don't have any place to go, of the responsibility on both parts of the congregation to say, wait a minute, what are we doing to close the doors to Jews? and people who have left to say, what am I doing that I've cut myself off? And how might the only synagogue in town identity be an advantage of modeling how to push the boundaries even wider and help people through that discomfort? I have no idea how to answer that question, but I'm curious and very confident that some of the social values that I know exist in Eugene, Oregon, and the values that I know exist in you, Rabbi Ruchi Sophia, are could really make that conversation a source of possibility, and how might we open it up, as opposed to but we're the only place, so we can't ruffle too many things.
Thank you, Rabbi Rachel, and Rabbi Ruby, please close us with the question that you have for Rachel and for us.
And this is for Rabbi Rachel as well as for all of you, actually. So it's very tempting to ask what gives you hope, and the answer might be nothing. I think it can be a little bit false to assume that we should always feel hopeful. Both many people have written beautifully about how you don't have to feel hopeful to do good work. And I think Jewish tradition especially encourages us to lean into obligation rather than necessarily optimism or hope. So I want to encourage you to think about, to what and to whom are you obligated, even in the absence of hope? And then, because it's complicated, you'll have that gut reaction. I know this. What else? To what else? And to whom else are you also obligated?
That was beautiful. Thank you both so much, and I'll see everyone very shortly for our closing plenary.